Okay, seeing that it is 10:30 a.m., I'm going to call to order the subcommittee work session for House Bill HB 1454 FN. And with that, I don't have a gavel, but I'll just use my hands. So we'll open the subcommittee work session. Just to briefly talk about where we were last week, we had some conversation around potential changes and tweaks in language. We heard from Representative Tucker and Director Wimsat a little bit about some of the varying geological structures throughout the state. And with that, I'd like to briefly open and allow Representative Tucker to come forward and just give us an update with any changes she may have had, and then I'll open the floor to the subcommittee work group members to continue with our work. So, thank you.
That's yours. Well, thank you for being here today. I really don't have much to add. Various members of the committee, your committee, have been working, and some last-minute thoughts of coming up, so I think that things are still bubbling along as people try to get this just right. On my way down here, I stopped in the town of Carroll, which I represent, made up of Twin Mountain and Bretton Woods, and saw that last year at their town meeting, they voted 202 to 75 against having a landfill in Dalton at their town meeting, which is an SB2 town, so they discuss it previous to that meeting. The town of Whitefield did the same, but the previous year by a much more overwhelming margin. And I wanted to bring that up because I think it's good to know that people who live in the area where there's a current pending partial application do have opinions on the topic. And really, I'm eager to hear what you have to say. I'm eager to get something in the hands of OLS so they can move forward. So I thank you enormously.
Thank you, Representative Tucker. I am going to also let the folks in the public know that there are copies of proposed language as presented by Representative Bixby. I think they're at the end of the table here. If you'd like to grab them, feel free to do so. And with that, I'm going to open it up for discussion among the subcommittee work group members. Representative Bixby?
Whereas protecting perennial rivers, lakes, and coastal waters from contamination is in the public interest of the state of New Hampshire. Oh, sorry.
Actually, and Representative Bixby, in my error, may I pause for a moment?
Sure.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that I also recognized that there is a member of the actual subcommittee work group who had a thought, and my apologies to the member. So, just one, but go ahead.
Okay, so 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 the first sentence basically says why this piece of legislation is in the public interest, and emphasizes that it's really about preventing contamination from reaching the perennial water bodies. And then a period of 5 years should be sufficient to detect and map a failure, assess appropriate remediation, meet engineering and regulatory requirements, and initiate a remedy. And I see I misspelled initiate there, but that's something we can do in drafting. So that basically sets the framework for what follows. And then what follows is pretty much what we were discussing last week. And I have removed from the middle of the next paragraph the words any leak, spill, or other failure, because that was a cause of confusion for people reading it, and we certainly don't want legislation to be confusing. So this basically sets out the policy of how this goes together, and then paragraph B sets out basically how the policy will be implemented. So the fundamental idea behind this is that before anybody wants to site a landfill, if they do this assessment and figure out that, yes, this is a viable site based on hydrogeology, then it makes sense for them to go forward. If they discover that their intended site may fail this test, then having done this at the very beginning, they will realize that this is not a good place to site a landfill, and they can look elsewhere. So that's the basic idea here. And I'm happy to, I guess Representative Comtois had some thoughts.
Please, Representative Comtois.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do have some questions and a couple of concerns. And I guess my first question will be for Director Winsett, if you don't mind. Currently, how many public landfills do we have in the state of New Hampshire that accepts from other towns, I guess is the question, because you have local landfill sites that only accept from their town, but then you have the ones that accept from other towns that don't have a landfill site.
Right. Right now, we have only 3 municipally owned landfills that are operating. Nashua just takes from Nashua. Lebanon takes from a limited service area that includes about, 8 or 10 towns in the area of Lebanon in New Hampshire, and another maybe 8 or 10 towns in Vermont. So they have the limited service area, but they do take waste from about 20 towns, both in New Hampshire and Vermont. And then the Mount Washington Valley landfill in Conway, and they take from Conway, North Conway, I believe they may be Albany and a couple of other towns, so there are a few other, but again, a limited service area. And then there's always gray categories. So the Androscoggin Valley Regional Refuge Disposal District owns and operates the Mount Carberry landfill in Success. So that's not maybe technically a municipally owned landfill, but it's a publicly owned landfill. It's owned by a district, and they operate commercially, and they have an unlimited service area, so they accept waste from all over New Hampshire and Massachusetts, Maine, and Vermont. And they could take waste from anywhere they'd like. They have an unlimited service area.
Are there any other public landfills in New Hampshire? I mean, is there one in Rochester, I believe? And
that's not a public landfill.
Okay.
The Rochester landfill is owned by Waste Management of New Hampshire. It's called the Turnkey Landfill, and that is a commercially operated landfill that accepts waste from with an unlimited service area. And then to round it out, the only one I haven't mentioned is the NCS landfill in Bethlehem, which is also a privately owned, commercially operated landfill with an unlimited service area.
Thank you. And Director Nguyen said, of the commercially run or landfills, which is Mount Carberry, Turnkey, and the NCS in Bethlehem, what is the life expectancy on each of those?
The current permitted capacity in Rochester at the Turnkey Landfill, they are permitted to operate through 2034. The NCES landfill is currently permitted to operate through 2026. And the Mount Carberry landfill is currently permitted, I believe, to operate through 2025. I should note that any one of those landfills is at liberty to submit a permit, an application for a permit to expand the facility. And in fact, we do have a currently pending application from Mount Carberry Landfill and Success to expand their landfill. And I guess what I would also note, in the case of NCS in Bethlehem, it is my understanding that due to local zoning that limits where in the town a landfill can be located, they do not have any, they're not in a position to expand the footprint of their landfill beyond the permitted capacity they currently have.
Thank you.
follow-up.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, one more question. With the, it looks like the Turnkey and the NCS landfills coming to an end, one in 4 years, the other one in 12. What impact will that have on the state and the constituents of New Hampshire? And how will it affect, I know you probably can't answer this, but how will it possibly affect their property taxes?
Well, so the landfill permit in Rochester goes through, currently permitted capacity goes through 2034. I don't honestly know, but I believe that Waste Management in New Hampshire believes it has options to expand that landfill further on the site where they operate. I don't know what that would look like.
Okay. One more?
Sure,
Thanks.
sure.
Thanks. Sorry. So NCS, it sounds like, doesn't have any options based on their footprint, is what I'm kind of understanding from you. And I mean, and this is subjective, so it's not, a hard, fast rule. How will that affect the towns that bring their waste to that landfill in those communities? And if they were to go to Mount Carberry or Turnkey, would that affect their ability to, even though Mount Carberry has been just approved to expand, would that probably decrease the time that they have to operate?
It shut me off. It was tired of listening to me. Happens a lot. So the Mount Carberry land, I'm sorry, could you repeat the question again?
If NCS were to close, because based on the information you just prescribed to us with the zoning ordinance and stuff, how, if those towns that are bringing their waste to NCS and they had to find an alternative, which would probably be Mount Carberry or the Turnkey, how would that affect their capacity? I know that Mount Carberry, you said just get an expansion, but not knowing, you understand what I'm saying?
Sure, I do, yeah, thank you for repeating that. It's a somewhat complicated question because the way we permit landfill capacity in this state, we must conduct a public benefit determination to ensure that any proposed expansion of an existing landfill will provide a substantial public benefit to the people of the state. And part of that a key part of that analysis is determining whether there's a capacity shortfall that would be satisfied by the landfill. And so when we permit these landfills, if we approve an expansion permit, we actually, in order to ensure that the facility provides a public benefit, we specify a particular number of years that the landfill is to operate and provide capacity for New Hampshire waste. And typically, we would put a total tonnage limit per year, how much waste they could accept. In practice, what often happens, not necessarily always, so it depends on the landfill and the decisions that the operators of the landfill make about how they want to run the landfill. But in practice, what often happens is that however much in-state waste they take, if they have excess capacity beyond what is needed to provide for that in-state waste disposal, they will often take waste from elsewhere, from out of state. So to the extent that the landfill facilities that you described would choose to operate by using all their allotted capacity each year, it's not clear that that it would make any difference, I guess. So what it would mean is, if suddenly there's more in-state waste that needs to go to that landfill, and the landfill operators chose to use their maximum capacity for the year, they could take whatever is provided for in-state, and then the rest could be supplemented with out-of-state waste. So it may not have an actual impact on the amount of capacity that's available year to year. If they chose to run at a rate lower than their annual permitted capacity, which we don't typically see, but it happens, then it could preserve some capacity, yes.
I also have a question. Can we go back to the permitting expansion footprint conversation?
Sure.
In addition to a footprint, that sounds like a circumference footprint. Is that what I'm
It's
hearing?
the actual lateral extent of where
Correct.
waste is actually placed on the land.
Okay, thank you. And one other follow-up, if I may then. To what extent is there an ability for someone to seek a vertical expansion?
Yeah, in landfills, when they seek a permit to expand, they typically seek both a footprint increase and a vertical expansion. There are certain sort of engineering controlled and geometric limitations on if you've got a given footprint size on how far you can go up vertically. And so if your question is, can a landfill just keep expanding vertically without expanding its permit? No, without expanding its footprint, no, there are limitations to that.
Thank you. Rep. Comtois?
Thank you, Director, and I'm sorry for
Oh,
all
no,
these
that's quite
questions.
all right. I'm happy to
but,
answer your questions.
So what you're saying, based on, if I understand correctly, is that the landfills, the Mount Carberry and the Turnkey, if the NCS, when it closes, would have to accept in-state refuse before they can accept out-of-state?
No, that is not the case. We don't specify how much of each kind of waste type they take. We do require, in order to find that there's a substantial public benefit, that they do need to provide capacity for in-state waste. But there's no sort of numerical metric that specifies how that's broken down.
Yes, follow-up.
So if they decided, I don't know, I like the number 100, it's nice and easy. So say they decided that it would only take 60% of New Hampshire refuse and the rest was going to be made up of 40% of out-of-state, and I'm assuming for dollar reasons, for operating costs. What would happen if there was excess New Hampshire refuse? Where would that go?
So the expectation is that these facilities in aggregate that are permitted here in the state will be prepared to take the waste that is generated in state. There are some waste that are actually disposed of out of state for private reasons that the generators of the waste make those decisions. I don't ever like to speculate about what the agency might do for enforcement, but obviously if a situation occurred where all the facilities in the state were not providing adequate capacity for in-state generated waste, the agency could look at whether those facilities were continuing to meet their public benefit requirements and take some action. But again, it's not something that we've encountered, and I hesitate to speculate what that might look like.
Follow up.
Thank you. So, the geography of New Hampshire, Bethlehem, Mount Carberry, and then NCS, which is over in the coast. With Bethlehem closing, would that be added fees to get rid of that waste if they had to go to Mount Carberry or the coast?
I really couldn't say what the tipping fees would be. Those are set by the individual landfill operators, and the agency doesn't have any regulatory authority over tipping fees.
Thank you.
Representative Stapleton, did you have a question?
I do. Thank you, Madam Chair. It's not relating to what you were talking about, but reviewing the draft, I thought that something was missing, and I'm thinking in terms of groundwater, drinking water, which is covered under RSA 485-C. We've referenced here surface waters as defined in RSA 483-B. And do we need to put in protections for groundwaters under the 485-C to protect marshes and swamps that are source waters for creeks, brooks, rivers, and then maybe even reservoirs, as well as aquifers that are not surface waters, but could be endangered by contaminants. And I have not had a chance to look further into 485-C to see if there are existing protections that relate to this in the siting of landfills. But we need to maybe take a look at that and coordinate those if there are not protections for siting under 485-C.
Thank
that-
you. Director Wimsatt, could you perhaps speak to any of that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So you know, groundwater protection, when we permit a landfill, when we look at potential impacts, groundwater protection is one of the primary things that we focus on. And indeed, you've identified RSA 45C does provide us with authorities to protect groundwater from a variety of potential contamination sources, including landfills. And actually, any permitted operating landfill is required to get what's called a groundwater release detection permit, which is a permit that is really, it prescribes a network of monitoring wells that need to be installed immediately surrounding the facility, background information obtained about, upgrading groundwater quality so that potential impacts from the landfill can be assessed relative to the existing groundwater quality. And then regular monitoring is required throughout the life and the post-closure period of the landfill to ensure that it's not adversely impacting groundwater. So there's a very robust system for doing that. Multiple times a year, those wells are sampled. And in the event that any contaminant of concern is detected above background, that triggers an assessment monitoring period where increased, more frequent, in some cases more frequent, and an analysis for a larger suite of contaminants is required to identify the source of the problem, and then once it's identified, to fix it. So there is already a robust system for protecting groundwater around our operating landfills.
Thank you. Follow up?
Follow up.
So with that, should we still make reference not only to the surface waters, but to the groundwaters and the 485 section as well as the 483 section to make the bill clear for coverage and just make that linkage? Is that advisable in this bill?
I couldn't advise on that. I do want to remind the committee members that the agency is not taking a position on this bill. We're happy to answer questions about the law and the current status of how we regulate solid waste facilities. but we're really not trying to weigh in on the content or the scope of the bill.
Thank you.
Representative Comtois?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Director. Based on the current guidelines that DES is using, do you feel currently that the regulations in place are protecting groundwater and drinking water based on what is in place now in statute?
Yeah, I think that, you know, we focus primarily on groundwater because that groundwater is right there immediately at the facility that underlies the landfill. It's immediately, you know, it's everywhere in the formation. And so I think that the protections and the monitoring associated with groundwater are very protective and they work very effectively. With regard to surface water, we're not, again, taking a position on this bill. I have said to the full committee before that we do, that's not to say that we don't believe that looking at how surface waters are regulated and protected under the statute isn't an appropriate thing for the legislature to be discussing. We absolutely believe it is. But because this bill and its efforts could potentially have an impact on an application that is currently pending before the agency, it puts us in a position where it's really not appropriate for us to take a position on the bill.
Thank you.
Representative Stapleton and then Representative Bixby.
For my own curiosity, do surface waters and groundwaters have an interplay, an interconnection? Does one feed the other or lead into the other, vice versa? Just a question about hydrology in general.
Absolutely. There's no question that in general, surface water and groundwater are intimately connected. And each one can potentially affect the other in a given circumstance.
Thank you.
Representative Bixby.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that the intent of this particular piece of legislation is to just address the existing or update the existing setback from surface waters, which is currently set at 200 feet, no matter what the geology and the hydrogeology look like. And it is, would it create confusion in terms of that setback from surface water goals to incorporate something about aquifers or marshes?
Well, an aquifer is really referring to groundwater, and a marsh, as I understand it, would really probably, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but I believe marshes would in many cases be classified as surface waters.
Okay. And would they be, so this is addressing surface waters as defined in RSA 483B4. Would marshes be included in that?
You know, I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that question.
Okay, so that's something.
I'm sure there are folks at DES that could answer that question, but I'm not sure I'm one of them.
Okay, and that's something we could look up in terms of, just look at that RSA and just confirm
Sure.
it. Okay. Thank you.
Representative Stapleton, did you have a question? Your light was on. Oh. Great. Yeah, just a moment. So if we're good with questions for Director Wimsatt, I'd like to open the floor to other folks who would like to weigh in. And if we have more questions, we'll call you up again.
And I apologize, I do need to take my leave in a few minutes.
Okay.
So if there are further questions for me, I would appreciate if I could hear them
Sure.
soon rather than later.
Okay. Any other questions for the director?
Not at this time.
Okay,
Thank you, Director.
thank you.
And if there's anybody who'd like to come forward to speak with regard to the proposals for the language or the bill itself, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll call you forward.
Hi, is there anyone in the audience from any of either the Turnkey or the NCS site here? Would you mind coming? Thanks.
Representative Comtois.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Could you just, where are you from, what company are you with, and what landfill?
Sorry about that. I'm with Casella Waste Management. My name is John Gay. I'm an engineer. I've been with the company for 24 years and been in the industry for about 30 years.
Follow up.
So I'm just wondering, it looks like that yours is the first landfill that's getting ready to come to the end of its life cycle, and based on what the director had to say, there may be no expansion possible for that landfill. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Follow up.
Thank you. And how many towns in New Hampshire, or cities in New Hampshire, does your site serve?
Well, we serve about 5,000 residents across the state of New Hampshire and upwards of 50 businesses around the state.
Okay. So, do you take out-of-state waste also?
Yes, we do. In 2021, I believe we took about 14% of our total inbound waste was from out of state. About 84% was from New Hampshire.
So,
Follow up.
thank you. With this new proposed legislation, would this have an impact on your business, or, in your opinion, the impact to the 5,000 residents and 50 businesses in state that you service?
Yes, I believe it would have an impact. So the customers that we provide capacity for would need to find capacity elsewhere, and the capacity that remains at the other facilities that were mentioned earlier would be consumed faster.
One more. Yep.
Thank you. And because I'm going to ask this is a subjective question, but because you're in the industry, with the closing of your landfill, would the tipping fees at the other landfills possibly go higher because now they're limited? I'm not sure how it works.
Yeah, that would be hard to say for me. I mean, it would certainly be up to the facilities that are accepting that waste. My professional opinion is that they probably wouldn't go up, but it's hard to say based on economics and what other changes might happen in the waste industry. It does seem, you know, that prices are going up for everything these days.
One more.
And just out of curiosity, if your company were to look for another place in the state, how long is the permitting process usually, from zero to open? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, so I'd say it's 0 to 10 years. You know, by the time you begin to look for a facility, you perform the field work to assess the site, permit the site, and construct the site, it's 10 years.
I think I saw a hand too from, Representative Bixby?
Yes, thank you for taking my question. Director Wimsatt mentioned that as part of the permitting process, there's a maximum tonnage that you're allowed to accept yearly, and that can be divided between in-state and out-of-state waste. If the new state of New Hampshire were to improve the diversion of things like recyclables and organic waste, et cetera, would you then fill up the rest of that tonnage with more out-of-state waste?
Well, so at North Country, we're permitted to accept 230,200 cubic yards annually. So there's a ceiling there. If some of that capacity was lost, you know, due to, you know, any type of diversion, you know, we would look to backfill that capacity for certain. So yes, I believe the answer is yes.
Okay, thank you.
I did have one additional question, and maybe it's not for you. I'm not sure if you are the design engineer or if somebody else can speak to the permitting process elsewhere in other states that do have hydrogeological setbacks, like some of our neighbors have a 6-year setback with hydrogeological time of travel, how that works if folks have sought permits in those places, and so just curious.
Yeah, I think based on my experience, I think the northern New England states anyway, all have similar rules that consider setback requirements. In Vermont, it's 300 feet to waters of the state. Here, it's 200. But I think, generally speaking, the rules are very consistent across the states, at least that I have history working within, including New York. So I think it is pretty consistent, and certainly has been effective, in my opinion. So.
And then there are some states that, in addition to a setback requirement, do have a time of travel consideration in statute. So can you speak to that?
I cannot speak to that. I'm not sure which state you're referring to.
Okay.
I don't have experience with
I see.
Maine citing.
Okay. Thank you. Representative Comtois? Representative Stapleton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for taking my question. I would imagine that even before this bill, that you have in-house or you hire professional hydrologists to really thoroughly examine the piece of property that's a target site. And they're measuring all of those criteria that we're focusing on, how much permeability and travel might be possible in the case of a breach or spill or something. Is that something that's already well-developed in engineering in your company for looking at a new site? Or is this something brand new to you?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yes, we hire consultants, third-party independent consultants who are professional hydrogeologists that evaluate the facility, as I mentioned, about 10 years to look at a site and then develop it to the point where you can actually start taking trash. In those early years, the hydrogeologist will go out, put monitoring wells in to understand the hydrogeology and the geology, to give us information so we can develop the footprint that we spoke of earlier. So the site is well understood from a hydrogeological and geological standpoint. For certain, it has to be, because the rules in New Hampshire require that, as Mr. Wimsatt mentioned, a groundwater management release detection permit, and that permit evaluates the siting for that particular facility, the groundwater movement, the rate of that movement, and wells can be added based on a proposal from the applicant, a review of the applicant's proposal by the DES, and then subsequent changes to that proposal to locate those wells in a manner that can detect a release from a landfill. Now, I think it's also important to note that today's landfills are double-lined, so you know, it's not like the landfills from 30 years ago where there was no containment system, and today we're still evaluating contaminated groundwater based on some of those older facilities. Today's landfills are double-lined. There's a system in place to capture a leak through the primary system if one was to exist. And then eventually, if anything was to ever get through the double-liner system, that is what we're talking about with the groundwater management and release detection. So if something was to breach the double-line landfill system, the groundwater monitoring network that was designed based on the study done by the hydrogeologist and the review of the state would detect a release and the direction that there would likely be a release. And then remediation or corrective action can be implemented immediately to correct that issue. And as I understand it, this system has worked very well for, 30 years across the state of New Hampshire and beyond.
Thank you. Follow-up?
Follow-up.
So, it sounds as though there's quite extensive study, research in the hydrology and the geology of a prospective site. With that, have you looked at sites that look promising at the outset, but then later on, with all of the information come back, have you rejected sites or taken them off the list?
Yes, we have.
And how many roughly would that have been, say, in the last 10 years of searching for other locations?
So we embarked upon a site-wide search for a replacement to our North Country facility in Bethlehem. I want to say probably 5 or 6 years ago. Don't hold me to that, but it's been a while. We looked at 5 sites in particular, for further consideration, and I believe 3 of those were not as promising due to the proximity to a surface water of the state of New Hampshire.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Are there any further questions? I know that Representative Tucker had your hand up at one point. Did you have an additional comment?
Yes, I was very interested in Representative Stapleton's comments, and I knew that because we had a chat before the meeting began, that he was speaking about the first line of the preamble as to whether that should be adjusted to including marshes or springs or other water sources. And it wasn't a general comment, it was very specific as a thought, should these words be changed? And I just thought it would be good for you to know how directed it was at that preamble as a time saver to the discussion.
Thank you.
So I see that Senator Hennessy is here. I don't know whether she wished to speak or not.
Was there somebody else? Yes, feel free to come forward. For the record, if you wouldn't mind stating your name and where you're from, that would be great.
Good morning. My name is Wayne Morrison. I'm a homeowner in Whitefield. I'm certainly not an expert in solid waste management, but in the last several years being involved in kind of researching and understanding this, I've been on a pretty steep learning curve. I just want to, in hearing the conversations about capacity that you were raising earlier, I just wanted to reiterate that this bill really has nothing to do with capacity. It has nothing to do with whether NCS closes or opens. It's really all about where you site a landfill. And the intent of the bill is really all about using science rather than an arbitrary distance. We've been operating for many years with a 200-foot setback, which none of us can figure out where that came from or don't believe there's any science behind it. And so the intent of the bill is really to figure out where we can safely put a landfill. The bill is not about limiting landfills. It's not about preventing landfills. It's not about any particular landfill. It's about how we operate in the state of New Hampshire, and when and if we need additional capacity, how do we put it in a place that is going to protect our waters and our rivers and our lakes, and to do it safely. We were involved in a bill last year that had to do with protecting our state parks, and we offered up a 2-mile buffer. And a lot of the feedback that we got, both from the House and the Senate, was about trying to be more scientific about that approach. Why 2 miles? Why not 5? We've done a bunch of research, and this bill is about putting science behind where we should site landfills and how do we protect our precious resources in the state. So I just want to reiterate that that's the essence of the bill. And all we want is to make sure if and when the state does cite a new landfill, which, by the way, no one can really remember the last time we did cite a new landfill. We believe there's plenty of capacity with the existing landfills and the expansions that will happen. But separate from that, if and whenever we do decide that we do need another landfill, we want it to be cited based on science and done in a location that will protect our natural resources. And that's what all that this bill is intended to do. And I would ask the committee to think of it in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you. Representatives, would you, yes,
Thank you,
Representative.
Madam Chair. Thank you for taking my question. So do you think, after looking at this bill, that it does adequately address the need for scientific approach to location with what we've covered in the bill so far?
I do. I think it's a great step forward. I think if you look at other states, there's a number of other states that have applied similar math. In fact, I think someone mentioned earlier that Maine, in terms of New England, is already using this methodology. I think they've actually used 6 years, so a little bit more conservative. But there are other states also, and when you think about 200 feet, 200 feet in some cases may be adequate based on the hydrology of the site. In other cases, it may be totally inadequate. And I do know that, I think there was a comment made earlier that we have monitoring wells and that we can quickly identify and resolve these problems. But the truth is, identifying the problem, coming up with a plan, putting mitigation in place, rectifying the problem, that takes time. And the whole point of this bill is to allow us adequate time to first detect the problem and then resolve it before it hits any of the waters that we're trying to protect. And 200 feet does none of that. It may be easy to measure, it may be intellectually very simple to process, but it can be totally ineffective in what it's intended to do. So this is an opportunity for us to make a very substantial improvement in the way we cite and the setbacks that we put in landfills. And I think as a rational person thinking about landfills are at the bottom of the waste hierarchy for a reason. They're complicated, they're risky, they involve toxic chemicals that can be released into the environment. And this bill is an attempt to realize that today we don't have, in some cases it's the only solution we have, but we should do it with the best available knowledge that we have, and this bill attempts to put science behind where we cite them. And I think it's a smart move for New Hampshire, and it's a step in the right direction about many things that we have to do in the solid waste business.
Thank you. Follow-up?
Follow-up.
So would it seem like the 200 feet or whatever is an old-time supposition measure, akin almost to picking a number out of a hat relative to the scientific methods that we have now and should be using for citing landfills?
Yeah, I wouldn't claim to know, the details of all that, but it seems to us that that was an arbitrary number that was picked years and years ago, and we haven't made any changes to it. We've continued to live with that, and we know a lot more now. We also recognize that things like PFAS and other forever chemicals that we didn't even know about years ago, they are much more prevalent, and the more we know, the more we should be concerned. And protecting our water today is, with the knowledge that we have, is ever more important than it ever was before.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions from the subcommittee work group members? I did have one other question, and thank you for indulging me for the moment. With regard to the ability to see how this is working in other states, have you spoken with anybody else who has similar, in your community, concerns, or what are you, as far as the setback, what are you noticing a trend with the desires to have this change, or can you speak a little bit more about that?
Well, I would go back to my frame of reference is, I got involved in this. We got a lot of feedback that, the setback requirements that we wanted to change should really be based on science. So we went off and we talked to scientists and we did some research. And part of that research was to look at other states. And I think if you do some research, you'll find that, 6 or 8 or 10 states have some form or some version of this bill. And, I think thinking about the way we not just this particular element of our solid waste plan, but we have a lot of legacy rules and regulations that have been around for a lot of years. Mr. Wimsatt would describe that, his agency has been for many years underfunded, understaffed, and has been living with a set of regulations that in some cases are antiquated. And we would suggest that this is one of them that we can make step function improvement by using science and updating the regulation to something that reflects the knowledge base that we have today that we didn't have 100 years ago when that regulation was put in place. That's not to say some of those regulations may still be fine, but it gives us great concern that we're operating in some cases with rules and regulations, although they may be large in number, they may not be effective in the way that they're actually meant to be in terms of protecting the health and the safety and the well-being of the people of the state of New Hampshire. And I think this in particular, this setback is an area that we could make great improvement. We could significantly improve the protections to some of our most precious resources by making a change to what is, I think, a relatively simple bill. The technology to do the testing and understand it is well known, and it's something that we could implement with no cost to the state and with great protections, benefits coming from it. So I think other states are struggling with the same thing. I think the state of New Hampshire, from what I can see, is lagging behind its neighbors. We haven't been as proactive. I think it's really good news that we're waking up and seeing that there's problems here and we're trying to address them. I think this is a very smart bill that makes a significant improvement, and we need to put it in place.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Representative Comtois.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Is there anyone here from Sanborn Head? How about the Turnkey or Waste Management? Is there anyone here from there? No? Okay, thank you.
Among the subcommittee work group members, myself, Representative Comtois, Rep. Stapleton, and obviously Rep. Bixby is not officially on the committee, but is able to participate, but has no vote. Right. But among the three of us, are there additional questions for anybody here today? Okay.
Yeah, no, I can't, I don't have any other questions. I wish that, I do have another question for Director Winsett, but obviously it's too late now, but yes.
And are there, yes. Would you like to speak before the committee? Yep, you're welcome to come on up. And for the record, if you could just state your name and.
Of course. Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for allowing me to speak to you. My name's John Swan. I live in Dalton, New Hampshire. I'm the founder of Save Forest Lake. We've been involved in an effort to protect and preserve our beautiful lake and state park from an encroaching landfill development. And obviously, as you've heard from other people, our involvement in all things solid waste has grown out of our effort to stop this project. I did want to point out that obviously the main point of this bill is to address, as was referenced prior, this old antiquated notion of a 200-foot setback from a body of water. In fact, I don't think anybody can tell you where or when that actually became a part of the statute, but that's the issue here is just like so many other numerous laws that are out there relative to a shortcoming that happens in society, and then people get together to address it in order to fix that. So that's what we're attempting to do here, and with the work of scientists. Representative Comtois asked some great questions today relative to landfill capacity, and I was very heartened to hear that the expansions at Mount Carberry have been referenced, because there's this false narrative that's being circulated that New Hampshire is in a capacity crisis relative to solid waste and landfills. Mount Carberry has a Phase 3A permit application that pushes them out to 2041, and they have a Phase 3B expansion permit that would eventually push them out to 2049 in terms of capacity. Mount Carberry takes in about 90,000 tons of waste from Maine every year. So imagine, as you heard from Joe Gay, who works for Casella at NCES, currently with their Stage 6 expansion permit, they're able to take in around 200,000 tons or so from New Hampshire. That could easily be assimilated by Mount Carberry. The only reason they're taking waste in from out of state is to help pay the bills. So the capacity is there for New Hampshire waste in New Hampshire. But one other point I'd like to make in terms of the costs for hauling, et cetera, think about it. The city of Concord is under contract with Casella, and that waste is being hauled to the North Country. Does that make any sense? Think of the environmental impacts of all that trucking. Whereas you look, if NCS, when they do go away, and they will, because this town of Bethlehem does not want that landfill in their town anymore for many reasons, why can't Concord waste easily be taken to the Turnkey Landfill in Rochester, which takes in about 60% of waste from out of state? So look at that. What we're talking about here with all these environmentally related bills before the session, or before this, the legislature this year, they're dealing with solid waste, and for a reason. So our outdoor economy, our outdoor recreation and tourism economies are doing so well, record season this past summer, because of our environment. So anyway, I appreciate the effort or the opportunity to speak today, and I just wanted to address that issue of waste being hauled across the state, not only from maybe Concord, but from Massachusetts to the North Country, which makes no sense, and there is plenty of capacity with future expansions, as Director Wimsatt mentioned. So I just hope someday someone will address with Director Wimsatt whether or not we have an actual capacity crisis, or, as we've alluded to or stated, the NCS landfill and the company Casella has a capacity crisis in New Hampshire. Thank you.
Representative Comtois, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for taking my question. So you just alluded to the fact that 60% of the capacity of Turnkey is from out of state, and that is used to offset operating costs. If that was to reduce to 30%, how would that impact the state as far as cost?
Can you rephrase that again, or say that again?
Sure. You mentioned that 60% of the turnkey refuse is from out of state, and that is to offset the operating costs, okay?
Well, or profitability.
If that was reduced to 30%, how would that affect New Hampshire property taxpayers?
Well, first off, as you point out, Turnkey Waste Management, they're a private corporation, so obviously, at this point, they're allowed to bring in waste from wherever they want. We can't curtail that. At the same time, in looking at everything that's happening in New Hampshire relative to solid waste matters, you point something out, or you allude to something that our state really needs to take a look at. Instead of trash being a profit center, trash should be looked at as a utility. And that's why you have, like, Mark Morgan's Lebanon landfill, you have the Mount Carberry landfill. They're not seeking to profit from waste. Obviously, they're seeking to take care of their citizens and their towns that use that landfill. So I think that's the paradigm shift we need to look at, instead of worrying about the profit center for a private corporation. In terms of property values in Rochester, I really can't speak to that. I mean, that's something that is obviously going to have to be looked at. But What's the alternative? To continue with the status quo?
Thank you.
Sure.
Representative Bixby.
Yeah, I'd just like to point out that this committee hearing is about a very narrow bill, and it seems like the discussion is reaching out into a much broader question of how are we dealing with landfill capacity in the state as a whole, and what are all the interconnecting factors. And I think that I'm not sure that this is really the time and place for that particular discussion. And I think that it would make sense to just focus on does this language serve the purpose that we want it to, and is this a purpose that we think should go forward?
Thank you, Representative Bixby. Representative Comtois?
I just want to thank Representative Bixby for reeling us back in, and thank you.
And I do see one, Representative Tucker again. Representative Tucker, do you have additional thoughts that you'd like to share?
Following on Representative Bixby's comments, I don't know that you've ever decided what to do with the remaining 2 boxed items, both of which are in Section B. And since you're focusing on getting language to go to OLS,
Yeah.
I hope, you need to decide whether you're going to keep those or change those or what you're going to do with it.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. I think we had spoken about them last time, and I just, for if my memory serves correct, with the working group, we had discussed the words adequate and representative last time, and I thought we were comfortable with that, but I want to make sure that
Well, when I saw that the draft that Representative Bixby had been so kind enough to work on still had the boxes, I was a little concerned,
I see.
because I just wanted to get it either
you
in or out.
Sure. Can you speak to why the boxes are still there? I think
Yes.
that's maybe,
Failure of editing. I could have removed them.
understand
I could have
perfectly.
removed them because we actually did pretty much resolve those at our last session.
And both, we can take the
We,
boxes
I
off.
think we agreed at the last session that both of those things, both of the boxed bits of text in paragraph B were fine as is, and I think that we also were pretty much resolved that the box in paragraph, in the middle paragraph, what's now the middle paragraph, was not good, which is why I have a strike through in
Right,
it.
I understand,
And,
I
and then
recognize that.
the preamble is essentially.
I'm just very focused on getting it ready to go to the OLS office.
Yeah, so.
thank you, Representative Tucker, and thank you, Representative Bixby.
So I'm, other than spelling errors, which I noticed there are at least 2, is there anything else in the preamble that it doesn't work for people?
I did want to go back to the conversation that Representative Stapleton had regarding the water, surface water interplay. And my question to you, Representative, and to you, Representative Comtois, are about the inclusion of that 485:C, if you felt like that was something that you were seeking, or where you were going with that.
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you for the question. I do believe that from the testimony we've heard and from what we know that it is integral, surface and groundwater is interconnected, interplay between them. And I think we should at least make a reference to the statute so that it's clear that there are other RSA legal lawful parameters that have to be considered. And you know, it seems like the industry knows that and are engaged in it, but for the clarity of law and statement in the bill, I believe we should make the reference to the 585 or 485C groundwater, at least as a linkage. And when Representative Tucker and I talked earlier on, it might even be preference with and other ground and other water sources Or maybe you could say, and other groundwater sources, or something of similar ilk, so that it's, expresses our concern for protection of both surface and groundwaters.
Representative Comtois, did you have any thoughts around this?
Well, I'm just reading here, and it looks like groundwater and surface water protection are integral parts of the siting permitting. And it's under, it says here, under environmental-SW 804.03, surface water protection standards section and rules. So there is a rule, I believe, already in place for that. And I could be wrong, but we could double check with Director Winsett. So.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
since we're having a citation here within the bill of the 483, what does it hurt to have reference to the 485, so we've got both surface and groundwaters referenced and linked? Even if it might be stated elsewhere, at least a single reading of this bill would make it clear that we're concerned with both.
I have a couple concerns, and I do have another question for Representative Tucker, if you don't mind, Madam Chair.
Absolutely.
Representative Tucker, it was listed that there are 8 or 10 other states that have similar legislation. And I'm just trying to find out the geography of those states. I know Maine was mentioned as one, and I was just wondering about the other states, only because New Hampshire is pretty unique in its makeup, because every single town and city in New Hampshire, except for one, has water running through it. And I'm just concerned about how this will affect future landfill sightings, that's all. So I'm just wondering about the geography of the other states.
I don't know the answer to that question. I do know that Maine has a tremendous amount of lakes and ponds. That is the state that I have actually read the material, and Maine is very similar, bedrock-wise, to New Hampshire. And I think that we can be assured that there are good sites for landfills in New Hampshire. Director Wimsatt has not implied that that is not so. He does say we have a complicated state, and it's certainly for a small state, it is complicated. But it's our job to protect the population. And I think that almost all of us have had the misfortune of living places where they didn't know what they were doing at the time. Certainly the Connecticut River is one of those places. I grew up in Concord, Mass. The Concord River, all of those, the Merrimack, they all were polluted terribly. And the Androscoggin, which has a mercury problem that's incredible. After 10 years, they still haven't been able to implement a plan to remediate. And so our focus in this bill is to protect the citizens of New Hampshire, the visitors to New Hampshire, the future of New Hampshire, and the wildlife of New Hampshire that's dependent, as we are mammals, birds, all life depends on the purity of water. So I ask you to really focus on that.
Thank you, Representative Tucker. Representative Bixby?
Yeah,
Comments?
I have a question for you, Representative Tucker. So this, the text of this bill is going to be inserted into RSA 149M9. And I'm wondering, just so that we have a sense of what the broader context within state statute is going to be, what does 149M9 cover?
Are we actually going to mention other RSAs in here?
Well, no, the enacting paragraph, the enacting section says, amend RSA 149:M9 by inserting after paragraph 14, the following new paragraphs. And so this text is going to be, that's where this text is going to be inserted.
That's why we turned to OLS.
Okay, so
That's really what they're,
So you're not familiar with the broader context that this is
I'm
going to
not
end
either,
up in?
no.
Oh, okay, thank you.
I must admit that I've kept a very sort of laser focus on what we're up to here.
Okay.
And I am dependent on OLS
Right,
and the person who works with this area.
right. So the reason I'm asking is because I want to make sure that it would actually make sense to figure out whether adding a reference to the groundwater in 45C would make sense in that larger statutory context. And it sounds like I need to do a little bit of
I think we need to
research.
to pose if you could help pose the question for OLS to answer. And then in turn, Courtney Eisenbach is in touch with DES, and that's her area of specialty. So that's, I think, the best way to get that resolved.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Bixby, also, 149M is quite a large, the statute is so
Uh-huh.
large, it covers so many things. So I just wanted to mention that it literally talks about all things related to solid waste management. So from waste reduction goals all the way down to siting criteria and then some.
Okay,
So there are various subsections within 149M, and so I'll just leave it at.
okay, thanks.
Yeah. So, and with that, I do think that, I do think we might have some drafting questions here that we need to get answered about, just in general, about the inclusion of the 45C and whether or not that is pertinent or to this
Right.
area. But I do understand Representative Stapleton's concerns in wanting to make sure that both surface water and groundwater are addressed.
Right.
So with that, Representative Comtois, do you have thoughts?
Well, I sometimes think, thank you, Madam Chair, I sometimes think that when we confine things too much in legislation, we actually hamstring the agency that's doing the rulemaking. And sometimes it could hinder things. I mean, I like to be as concise as possible, but as I cited, there's already in the rules the link between groundwater and drinking water.
Appreciate that. Chairman Pearl.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate you recognizing me. Just for the benefit of the subcommittee and all those that are here today and listening, I've scheduled another final work session on this bill next Tuesday at 10:30. So but it's not going to be, it's more or less going to be a wrap-up of the subcommittee so that you can make a recommendation to the full committee meeting at 11. So there won't be really any time for a lot of public input on that one. It'll more be the subcommittee kind of wrapping up their thoughts. And then we'll be going into a full committee work session at 11 a.m. to take up the recommendations of the subcommittees and to exec these bills, because I've got to move them forward. I'm starting to run up against a deadline on them. So just wanted to give you all a heads up of where we were in the process so you would know. And sounds like you've had a great subcommittee meeting, and I certainly do appreciate the work that the committee is doing here. And I was hoping to catch a bit more of it. I got called into a different meeting, so I missed the first half hour, but I appreciate all that you're doing. But again, I wanted to give you that info so everybody kind of knew where we were.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Chairman. To the subcommittee work group members, I also did want to ask if you thought it would be helpful or pertinent to ask our committee researcher, which I do believe we have access to the committee researcher as a subcommittee, about the other states that have this.
I would find that very helpful, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I will reach out and get that information. Are there any other questions or comments from those out in the public? If not, I'd like to then notice that we are going to have an additional final subcommittee work session next Tuesday. What is that date? 10:30 a.m. on March 1st. So with that, I'm going to close out the subcommittee work session. Before I do,
Yeah, I actually have a question for Chairman Pearl. In terms of the drafting an amendment on this, do you have a preference in terms of who the sponsor of that draft should be? For the amendment?
Not at this time, but let me think about that.
Okay.
I guess I'll have to think about that. I don't know that it's going to matter. Probably should be someone from your subcommittee, but I don't know that it has to be. So definitely has to be somebody from the full committee.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so all things being equal, I would propose that Subcommittee Chair Murray be the sponsor on it.
I think that would be appropriate.
I'll take that into consideration. Thank you. Okay, and so with that, we're going to close out the subcommittee work session, and just so that we are clear, Tuesday at 10:30, March 1st, followed by the full committee at 11 a.m.
Thank you.
Thank you.